Dueling is a very interesting concept that I'm currently fascinated by. I'm pretty sure you all saw it in a TV show or read about it in a book where one person brings a slight, an offense to another, and the second person demands satisfaction. And that satisfaction turns the form of swords at dawn or pistols at noon, until only one person manages to be victorious. In reality, that is a very romanticized version of what dueling was like. Dueling comes from honor cultures, cultures that didn't really have a strong rule of law, that didn't really have a stable militia in order to guarantee the peace. As such, it was up to the family to bring upon justice whenever a member of the family received the slight. So, in the case of Nordic cultures, think of the Vikings. If you insulted a member of a family, then his entire family would descend upon you, and you would probably bring your own family. And you can see the problem with this. It's too violent, too barbaric. A better solution had to be found. And that solution was that in the dueling, where only the parties that have been offended are going to partake in the practice. And notice how it was very difficult to fake offense under these circumstances. Because if you weren't offended, chances are you wouldn't risk your life away. And if you did accept and challenge someone to a duel, then it means that the offense was legitimate and it genuinely attacked your honor and reputation to the point where you would put your life on the line. Now, for us, it seems a little bit ridiculous if you think about it. But for people living in that time, especially members of the aristocracy, they were wealthy beyond belief. So for them, money wasn't really an issue. For them, the currency was honor. So maintaining a person's honor, reputation, and standing in society as an aristocrat was paramount. And this is why these people would challenge others who gave them a slight to a duel. And because of this, slander and libel were at an all-time low. Because you knew that if you were to do this to someone, you could get challenged to a duel. Now, what's interesting about it is that when the person says they demand satisfaction, it wasn't necessarily that they would challenge you to a duel. The option to apologize was always on the table. So if you were to bring slanderous accusations upon a noble or insult his wife, and he would challenge you to a duel, then you could just apologize for it and everything would be fine. Alternatively, if you legitimately believed in the accusation that you were bringing, accepting the duel was also an option. What wasn't an option was to choose neither of the two things, in which case society would have deemed you as a coward. As not only you are not willing to apologize, but you're not willing to give satisfaction to the other gentleman that you have insulted. Now, believe it or not, duels were very rarely to the death. Now, it did happen, and it mattered a lot on the weapon that was chosen. For example, pistols were a lot more deadlier than swords, and usually the duels would last until first blood was drawn. They were also surrounded by a lot of rules and rituals. There would be certain witnesses, people of high standing, that would watch the duel taking place. And before the duel, they would also try again to reconcile the parties. And if no reconciliation could be found, then the parties were expected to carry out the duel. And finally, there were strict rules over whom can challenge whom to a duel. So, for example, a peasant was not able to challenge an aristocrat. And I've never heard a case where a peasant could challenge a peasant to a duel either. Usually it was done between aristocrats or members of the military, but again the same rule apply. An officer of lower rank would not be able to challenge a general to a duel, but they could challenge another officer of a similar rank. So the question is, what ended the practice of dueling? Well, believe it or not, it wasn't necessarily because it was bloody. The people at the time did not have any problem with this. One of the arguments that the church made against dueling was that they were concerned about people who wanted to commit suicide would challenge someone else to a duel and thus finding a loophole in ending their life. Because according to the church, suicide is a great sin, and they couldn't tell if a person was legitimately wanting to win the duel. And apparently, there were several cases where people who were suffering from depression would use this as a way out. Another reason was the one that I mentioned before, that in the army, a lot of officers would challenge each other to duels, and this would cause mayhem within the military. Often soldiers would end up without commanding officers, whether it is because they have been killed through the duel or wounded to the point where they can't serve anymore. And again, this was something that the British government especially was worried that a lot of officers use duel as a way out from serving in the front lines. The concern was that they would talk with a fellow officer, which would shoot them in the leg and thus incapacitate them and take them out of combat. So this is what actually ended the dueling. And in other places, it just simply fell out of practice because the nobility, instead of dueling, just started using lawsuits. In other words, if you were offended, instead of taking matters into your own hands and proving that you were offended, you now use the power of the state to give you satisfaction over an offense that now can either be legitimate or fake. So let me know what you think about this medieval cancel culture that existed at the time, although I've not heard anything similar in Europe. The only exception, however, is that you can challenge someone to a boxing match or an organized contact sport event, but nothing to the extent like in the US, where you can just duke it out with someone as long as a cop is present. I find it quite interesting the more I read about it, because it was quite of a wide practice that took place throughout human history, and it's interesting to try understand why it existed because, as I mentioned before, it was a widespread phenomenon throughout the world. And in Western countries, it was just between the offended parties. But again, like in certain Nordic countries, like with the Vikings, you would have entire clans clashing over the insult of one person to another, and this would lead to really prolonged blood feuds where you would have a first clash and one clan would manage to injure or kill some of the members of the other clan, and they wanted revenge, so then you have another clash, and it would lead and it would spiral out of control, and this caused a lot of mayhem, which is why later on even the Vikings adopted the British way of dueling, where it's just the two people that are the offended parties partaking in the activity. However, this honor clan system, and this can be seen even today in certain countries, especially in places where the rule of law is incredibly flimsy and it operates a clan-based thinking and a strong honor culture. So luckily, we don't live in a place like that because our ancestors adopted dueling. And believe it or not, certain variations of it exist today. For example, in Washington, D.C., if two adults consent and they go in front of the presence of a cop, they can actually have a fisticuff going on. They can punch each other, with the added clarification that there needs to be some rules involved. So when one of them decides that they had enough, or when one of them seems to be unconscious, then the cop can intervene and separate the two. And similar laws do exist in other US states. I'm legitimately curious what you guys think and whether you would want me to make these types of videos where I talk about interesting historical facts every now and then. If there is interest for people to see me talking about it, I can do a lot more interesting videos and analysis in the future. Until then, I will see you guys in the comment section.